thankful when God provides us this opportunity to just fellowship. Today marks the beginning of Advent, Christian calendar, and it so happens that as I celebrate this Advent, it's an opportunity for me to say, to give a big thank you to you all. Many people, this is it marks my 1 year here at Glenmar. So it's an opportunity for me to say thank you. So many people have reached out to me as I was transitioning here, reached out to me with prayer, words of encouragement, and so I appreciate. I always, laugh when even, some people that you never think that they are helping, what I'm doing here. In as much as we know the tech team always doing some work helping even the person who is up here. But there's one thing that they always remind me, particular of this service, especially when I have to administer communion. They always remind me, remember, it's communion today. And remember, we are doing the Lord's Prayer today. So all those things, at times, people think that they just take it for granted that they are just doing it. But yet, it means a lot. And I really want to thank you and many others who have been by my side as I was transitioning. I'll never get an opportunity to thank you individually, but I use this opportunity to thank you also. Thank you so much. Coming back to our theme of the day, worship fully. Worship fully, that's our title for today. And I don't come to you claiming to know this, to know it all, but how we can worship God fully. But I come to you inviting you to say, join me. Can you please join me? Learn how best we can worship God fully. And on this journey, last night as I was walking down to the office, I met Margaret on the way, and she said, Cecil, you are preaching this weekend, are you ready? And, I said, Margaret, you know what? This is one time whenever I'm preaching, this is one point where I always asking God, what is it that you are, what's your agenda today? What are you up to? So I understand and I'm in tune with God, implying that I want to know God's agenda, so that it ceases to be my own agenda when I'm standing here, but it becomes God's agenda, God's business, a business that can challenge even myself, where I say, well, as I was standing up there, God spoke to me, and this is how God challenged me. So I invite you, as we learn together, to say, how best can we worship God fully? And one suggestion that I have for you is for us to look at the Hebrew language and identify how they describe worship. What was worship? How they defined worship. Said shaka, which means due reverence. And in Greek, there are 3 terms that defines worship. One of them is proskuneo, which means adore, worship. It occurs in the New Testament 59 times. And the other term is sebomai, which means to reverence, hold in awe. And this term appears 10 times in the New Testament. And the other term is latrio, meaning to render religious service of homage. And this term appears 21 times in the New Testament. And this leads us to a point where it suggests that the meaning of worship is one that is not centered on the worshiper, but the worshipped. So as we gather here today, one proposition that I have is that as we try to explore what it means to worship fully, as we look at these two languages, we arrive at the conclusion that it's about the one who is worshipped. He's supposed to be at the center, and the worshippers are now looking up to the one who is to be worshipped. And as such, I realize that as I come to worship, oftentimes I come thinking that I'm in tune. But yet, as the choir sings, as the band sings, at times the scripture is read, at times as the message is proclaimed, I realize, oh, I have come here, but I am out of step. Out of step. When humankind drifts from worship that is God-centered to humankind-centered, that's a drift. And oftentimes I find myself in that predicament and realize that I am out of step. When humankind puts emphasis on its own desires, we realize that by so doing, we are out of step. For example, Micah chapter 6, verse 7. The Israelite people approached God, viewing worship as an event. Inasmuch as they said, how can we worship? But you can hear their question is, it suggests that they had an answer. You know, there are times when our kids ask us for something, they have an answer of their own. Oftentimes, it's always a yes to what they're asking for. And the Israelite people seem to come to God with an answer. As they are engaged by Micah, as Micah dialogues, engages them in a conversation, they seem to suggest that they had an answer. They already knew and thought that worship was an event. How so? Because they had a checklist of their own. A checklist where they were saying, Micah, if we bow down, is it enough? Then we can go back home and say, well, I was in worship, I bowed down, then I am okay. I am good to go. Micah, when I bring my burnt offering, is that okay? Is that sufficient? Then I can go back home, do my usual stuff. Micah, if I bring some calves, is that okay? Is that enough? Then I can go back, sit, relax. Micah, if I engage in extravagance to a point where I offer 1,000 rams, where I offer 10,000, tens of thousands, rivers of oil, is that sufficient? Micah, what about if I look at my neighbors and say, oh, our neighbors are giving their firstborn because it was a practice then in some religions where they offered their firstborn. And they approach Micah and say, how about we buy into that culture where people are giving their firstborns? They brought this checklist to Micah. Micah chapter 6, verse 7. In a world where there was a culture, Micah becomes a prophetic voice. Advent season is a season where Christ is saying, I'm coming. I'm your Redeemer. I want to be present with you and be that voice that can remind you when you're out of step. And today, as we are gathered here, the voice of the Redeemer is here to remind you and me that yes, the Advent season is a time of reflection. However, it's counterculture when we suggest that it's a time of reflection. Because guess what? I don't know about you, but for me, each time I walk to the mailbox, as I take some mail, I always realize that maybe 95% of my mail, 97%, is all about this is the offer, this is what we are offering, these are the deals, this time of the year. Oftentimes I stand by trash can and throw away almost 97%, because it's always about buy something. We are offering this, we are offering this. So to suggest that this Advent season is a time for us to reflect. It's a time for us to recognize the one who is in our midst. The Son of God is in our midst. The Son of God is coming. That's one message that Micah had for his contemporaries. Messiah is coming. Prepare for the Messiah who is coming. That's counterculture. Because that's not the mood that people would want us to be. It's about, what do I need to get? But today we are reminded that it is an opportunity for us to experience wholeness, where wholeness is possible. That's why Jesus had to engage the woman of Samaria in a conversation. The woman of Samaria who ended up coming out and suggesting that worship was about a place and the continuation of a tradition. That's why she said, you know what, Jesus, we used to come to this place. Our grandparents used to come to this place. It is about this place. That's where we gathered. That's where we conveyed to worship. So in other words, this woman was suggesting that it's complete whenever we step into that space. It was about a tradition that had been handed down by the great parents. But Jesus challenges this woman's understanding of worship. Jesus points out that worship is no longer tied to a place, but the worshipper's consciousness of the one to be worshipped, God. In other words, Jesus reminds this woman that wholeness is possible because I'm here. The Redeemer is here to bring about the possibility that you can right here, right in this moment, experience wholeness. That's why John chapter 4, verse 23, Jesus says, yet a time is coming, and has come now, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in the truth. For they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and His worshippers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. Implying that wholeness is possible. Inasmuch as for so long this woman had been held back by the understanding that worship is about a place. When she was not in a certain place, she could not experience the redeeming love of Christ. She could not experience the redeeming love of God until and unless she was in a certain place, until she was part and parcel of a certain tradition that had been passed on. But Jesus reminds her, no. It is about the Spirit. The Spirit that cannot be bound by a space. The Spirit that cannot be bound by time, but the Spirit that is free to flow in this direction and this other direction. In other words, it can reach you wherever you are, because this Spirit is not bound, it's not fixed in a space, but it's fluid. It can go in any direction. So if you are here, the Spirit can reach you. If you are on the other side, the Spirit can flow and reach to you. We can experience wholeness to an extent that if there is a dent in our lives, if there is some brokenness in our lives, we can indeed experience wholeness, because Christ is right there in our midst, waiting and longing for us to open up. Jesus defines worship as communion between God and humankind. Where we are in a relationship with Christ, we are in a relationship with God. Irrespective of place, irrespective of time, irrespective of distance, He is ready and willing to engage us. Space or distance do not limit our access to the triune God. Nothing. He is not bound by anything. He is free to reach us wherever we are, at whatever point, He's ready for us. In other words, Christ was reminding the Samaritan woman, Advent season is the time when God is made accessible to all, accessible 24/7. So it's no longer about 1 a.m. when people had to be in a certain place. It's no longer about 1 p.m. when people had to be in a certain place. But God is with God's people wherever they are, at whatever time, whatever moment, no matter what was going on. This woman was so used to carrying her burdens. That was her understanding, to live with her burdens, to live with her limitations. She had identified with those limitations, and she had allowed those limitations to define who she was. And she had settled to those circumstances. But Jesus is now saying, woman, wholeness is possible right here, right at this moment. Christ, God, is available 24/7. Whether we are driving our cars, whether we are walking, whether we are riding our bicycles, right there, Christ is present, our Redeemer. That's why when we allow worship to impact us, to an extent that we can indeed worship God fully, leads us to a point where we respond to God's love in community. That's why here at Glenmar, there's emphasis, sticky faith. She emphasizes intergenerational worship, where we can allow these young people to impact us. And we look at them and see how they carry themselves as they interact with others. Look at them, look at the babies and watch them smile, and look at them and say how innocent. And that impacts us as we are in worship, because we become a group of people that come, not based on our age, but there's an intergenerational community ready to learn about worship. This is an opportunity for worship to impact us in the same way that this woman ran to the community. In the same way, here at Glenmar, that's why we emphasize on small groups. And our dream, our vision is to get to a point where small groups become our DNA, becomes part of who we are as Glenmar, where we reach out. For example, I reach out to Karen, and Karen says to me, Cecil, what group do you belong to? And I reach out to Karen and I say, Karen, what group, small group do you belong to? I'm no longer hesitant about asking Karen, group do you belong to? Because it becomes a culture where each and every one of us belongs to a community. They're in a small groups where they are getting support and engaging, wrestling with those deep questions that hold us back, where we can grow and come to an understanding of what worshiping God fully means, where we can find ourselves getting that support that we need. One time, I was in that kind of group in my own home, in one way. When Emily and I, you see, I had this habit of holding on to stuff. You know, this time of Advent season is learning to be open, willing to learn and unlearn at the guidance of the triune God. Small groups give us that opportunity. Intergenerational worship give us that opportunity in the presence of the triune God. But I want to illustrate this point by sharing with you my experience where I had to unlearn something that had become part of me, holding on, like I said, to stuff. One day, a friend of ours came to our home and we were cleaning up. And I was comfortable enough throwing small stuff away. But she reached out to me and said, Cecil, do you really need this? And you know what? I said, I think maybe Emily needs this. You see, that's what we do when we are trying to cover up. I found myself trying to cover up this resistance to throw away stuff. I was comfortable. You know, there are times when we are comfortable holding on to a book that we've read maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago, and we still say, maybe I'll use it sometime. And some other stuff that maybe a chair, maybe this chair, I will use it sometime. Maybe this, whatever it might be, I will use it sometime. But this friend of ours says, Cecil, do you still need this? Maybe Emily needs it. She reached out to Emily and said, Emily, Cecil said, maybe you need this. And we were in separate rooms, so she reached out to Emily. Emily, then this friend of ours called out Emily, called me, and we were right there together. She was standing in the middle, and she said, Emily, do you need this? And Emily said, maybe Cecil needs it. So I was exposed. I was in the open. And there I was, and I had to unlearn, and I said, well, maybe I don't need it. And I had the freedom to throw it away, in as much as I had held on to that thing. But I realized, with the support of a friend, I had to unlearn and give up stuff. I'm still learning to give up stuff. My brothers and sisters, Advent season is an opportunity for us to unlearn. I don't know what you have to unlearn. At times, maybe you don't know some stuff that I have to unlearn. But maybe this is a calling where God is calling us to a higher ground, where we can indeed unlearn certain stuff. The challenge that Micah encountered was that the worshippers who were approaching him, trying to inquire from him, they are the very same people who were coming to him with that checklist. Why? Because they wanted something that would make them feel good, go back to their usual stuff. They are part of a society or a system that was oppressing, practicing injustice outside worship. So they wanted to go back, support that very same system that was perpetuating injustice. They are part and parcel of that same system. So they were saying, can we just give burnt offering and go back and engage in our injustice? Can we just come and give burnt offering and go back and engage in our injustice? Can we just give some calf and go back and engage in our injustice? Can we engage in extravagance or pour out a quantity of oil and go back and perpetuate injustice? But Micah invites his contemporaries to learn under the guidance of the triune God. Micah invites his contemporaries to the focal point. The focal point becomes, what does God require of us? Moltmann, my favorite theologian, as we try to allow worship to impact us, here's a suggestion. He points out something that amazes me. He says, because of the incarnation of God's love, in the sending and self-surrender of Christ, the love of God is realized in love of our neighbor, and realized in such a way that the neighbor is loved for himself, and not as a means to a higher end. Love becomes at the center. Knowing that indeed Christ is not in the business of beating us down. Christ is not in the business of pulling us down. Christ is not in the business of reminding us of our shortfalls. Christ is not in the business of making us feel bad, But Christ is in the business of saying, this is an opportunity for you to experience wholeness. I'm right here in this space. Are you willing and ready to learn from Christ this Advent season and celebrate Advent season in a new way, where Christ indeed transforms us from within, where worship becomes an opportunity for us to experience the redeeming love of our God, the grace that abounds here, right here in this moment. The grace that it takes us to a level where we are reminded, where we ask ourselves, what does God require of you? It's no longer about what does God require of the band that was singing here. It's no longer about what does God require of Karen who was leading. It's no longer about what does God require of this particular individual. It's no longer about what does God require of DC who is leading youth. But it's about what does God require of me. It's no longer about what does God require of those who are gathered at the 11 o'clock worship service. But it becomes a Cecil, what does God require of you as an individual, as you stand right there? What's your agenda? Is it God's agenda, or is it your own agenda? What does the Lord require of you? That becomes a question that is right in front of you, right in front of me. Before I send a text message, before I make a call, before I go to some place, before I say something to my neighbor, before I say something to my friend, before I say something to my family member, before I say something in my community, what does the Lord require of me? What does the Lord require of me? That was the challenging message to Micah's contemporaries. Yes, I know you want to go back and continue supporting this injustice. But what does the Lord require of you after you leave this worship service? Micah is saying, what does the Lord require of you? It's not what about God requires of those who are over there, but what does the Lord require of you? What does the Lord require of me? And as such, we can go. Let's go, my brothers and sisters. Let's go. To an extent that those who are used to participating with us in some form of injustice, they will be surprised when we return home, when we return back to those usual places where we meet with those individuals. They see us in a different way because indeed we have experienced one who has brought wholeness in our lives, where the burdens that we have been carrying for a long time, like this woman of Samaria, the burdens that she had been carrying year after year, she would go to those places of worship, return back home, carrying the same burdens, and she had identified herself with those burdens. That's who she was. But right at that moment when Christ reminded her, oh, worship is about the possibility of transformation. The grace is right here. The Spirit is flowing. Oh, from which direction the Spirit is here? Woman of Samaria. She realized she was no longer bound by space. She was no longer bound by tradition. She was no longer bound by distance. From that point on, she ran back to the community. She went and said, come and see the one who has patched my dents, the one who has healed my wounds, the one who is now carrying my burdens. Come, I am ready to engage with you as a community like never before. Oh, Advent season, it's an opportunity for us to experience the grace of God like never before, such that we will live here and go back and say, I am no longer the same. Come and see. Come and see. Messiah, Messiah, Messiah. In other words, the worship becomes a way of life. 24/7, we are no longer limited, but we can experience the redeeming love of God wherever we are, whether we are in our homes, whether we are on our cars, whether we are flying, whether we are walking. We can experience the redeeming love of God and the assurance that indeed we are loved, indeed we are cared for, indeed we have hope for a better tomorrow. For in our midst, we have a caring Savior who is ready to walk with us on a daily basis, encouraging us when we fear doubts, when we face doubts, when we encounter challenges. We know, indeed, in this home, in my life, I am in the company of the Redeemer who loves me like never before, who cares for me like never before. Worship becomes a way of life. Way of life. No longer limited to a space. Let's go. Let's go to our friends. Let's go to our neighbors. Let's go to our family members that they may experience this redeeming love of God. Let's go and re-examine our priorities. Let's go and do justice. Let's go and live a life of kindness. Let's go and walk humbly with our God, 24/7, walking in the presence of God, walking in the presence of this freeing Spirit, the Spirit of God that resides in us, giving us hope as we move into the future. Amen.